Whoops. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome on behalf of Nature Finance to this morning's session on planning for a future beyond 1.5 degrees warming. May I, as a starter, ask you for a favor? Can you put your phones on silent? This is a very important conversation. Earlier this week, the EU Copernicus Climate Change Service confirmed what many of us feared. 2024 will be the first year in human history with an average temperature exceeding 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, likely, when it's all said and done, to reach 1.6 degrees at the end of the year. But, ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a number. It's a turning point. It's a world shift. We are entering, ladies and gentlemen, a new reality, one where changes will unfold unpredictably, exponentially, and at times uncontrollably. The cascading effects in the natural world, but in the human world as well, and the two are essentially so deeply interlinked, will reshape everything we know. This demands conversations of a different kind, a shift in mindset. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary engagement. At Nature Finance, we have been sparking a conversation around this point for a while, as seen in the piece we published last year, aside COP28, and it was called Time to Plan for a Future Beyond 1.5 Degrees, because beyond 1.5 degrees, there is still agency, in fact, a lot of it. There is, in fact, an obligation to move from what is necessary is impossible to what is impossible is necessary. We have to go from polycrisis to polyopportunity. But let's be honest, incremental change will not meet the demands of this moment. We really have to move into a different scale. The climate, nature, and biodiversity crises are immense, but perhaps the greatest crisis we face is human inertia. Our inability to act decisively despite knowing what's at stake. And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, we must rethink systems fundamentally. We started this process of rethinking systems by looking at food. Food is the very foundation of human survival and prosperity. This is why today, on the 12th of December 2024, we have launched our food report, Future-Proofing Food for a Rapidly Warming Planet, Financing Food for the Future. The hard truth is this, ladies and gentlemen. We will not be able to nourish 8+ billion people in a world that is being severely disrupted by climate breakdown, nature loss, and biodiversity collapse. At least certainly not the way we have up to now. And so this report is both a warning and a guide, offering profound food for thought, no pun intended, on how we navigate the stormy waters ahead. Because the global food system, on which every single one of us depends, is under unprecedented pressure. Climate change is already disrupting supply chains. Recent coffee prices, I'm sure you had coffee this morning, coffee prices skyrocketed to nearly 50-year highs because of droughts in Brazil, for instance. Rice supply has been devastated by droughts and floods in Asia and Europe, leading to deep price instability. And resource depletion and geopolitical instability are compounding these very challenges. At the heart of the report is a critical insight. Food security lies at the intersection of climate resilience, biodiversity preservation, and human well-being. Here is the challenge, and obviously, here is the opportunity. Low and middle-income agricultural producers are most vulnerable to climate change and nature loss, risking food insecurity, economic fragility, and displacement. And here the opportunity is, we propose a dual strategy to transform our food system. On the one side, scaling regenerative agriculture to restore soils, enhance biodiversity, sequester carbon, and build resilience against extreme weather. But also, and this is the second point, investing in resilient and adaptive food technologies, which we call RAFT. Capital-intensive, innovative approaches like vertical farming, alternative proteins, and controlled environment agriculture that can produce food no matter the weather, no matter the place. The expansion of RAFT technologies has the potential to ease pressure on natural landscapes by reducing reliance on extensive agricultural land, preserve limited areas of viable land for ecosystem restoration and nature recovery. But there is a catch. There is a catch. Scaling this solution obviously requires financing. Change of nature loss, risking food insecurity, economic fragility, and displacement. So we propose, our report estimates that between US 30 and 65 billion in research and development investment is needed over the next 10 to 15 years to make these food technologies cost competitive. And when you think about it, it might look big, but in fact it's a very, very small number, especially if we compare it to the US 600 billion we currently spend annually subsidizing conventional agriculture, a model we now know is neither sustainable nor future-proof. So reforms are essential. The report highlights potential approaches to scaling the solution, such as redirecting subsidies towards sustainable outcome, deploying financial tools like nature and carbon credits, performance-linked financing, and tax incentives tailored to regional contexts. And scaling private investment through international cooperation and lessons from pioneers like Singapore, Brazil, and Rwanda are obviously very much part of this report. So these early-stage national examples demonstrate what's possible. We can build food systems that are climate resilient, cost-efficient, and capable of delivering for people and the planet in a rapidly warming world. This is the kind of bold, difficult thinking that extraordinary times demand. This report is indeed an urgent call to action, but also a blueprint for hope. So, to dive deeper, I invite you to scan the QR code and download the full report. Let's work together to ensure that the food systems of tomorrow can nourish both people and planet, no matter how stormy the weather becomes. Now, before I give the floor to our extraordinary guests and thought leaders who will share their thoughts in this phygital fireside chat. Rupert Reed is online, not here on stage. Let's hear first from someone who truly embodies systemic transformative leadership. Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever and author of the extraordinary book Net Positive, has indeed graciously pre-recorded a special message from us. Let's hear what he has to say. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. It is with regret that I can't be with you today, as I'm actually in Indonesia. But I take heart knowing that this room is filled with leaders who share a profound commitment to tackling the defining challenges of our time. We know that we stand on the edge of a precipice. Passing 1.5 degrees Celsius is no longer a distant warning or an abstract milestone. It is a reality already crashing down upon us. Unpredictable shifts, compounding crises, and systems disruptions are no longer tomorrow's problems. They are today's reality. The interconnected nature of these crises, like climate change, biodiversity, food security, economic stability, inequality, and social cohesion, require leadership of equal scope and ambition. The question now is not only whether we can slow down these forces, but how we will rise to meet them. And yet, when we look around at our global leaders, to be frank, sometimes it's hard not to feel dismayed. How is it that in the face of these existential threats, so many remain marred in trivial? Last month's Climate COP reminded us of an uncomfortable truth. Our ability to act is not limited by resources, but by our priorities. Global leaders argue over a few billion here and a few billion there, essential to support the world's poorest and most vulnerable, whilst untold trillions perpetuate the very crisis we claim to be solving. It's a bitter irony that we are so adept at building the tools of destruction, while seemingly incapable of investing in our own survival. I'm often reminded of what Helen Keller said when people told her that it must be terrible to be blind and deaf, and she always gave the same answer. I say, paraphrasing, that frankly, the worst thing is not being blind. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. And I believe there's still too many of us in this world whose eyes are shielded by the barriers of comfort, safe within even smaller islands of prosperity, unable or unwilling to see the tide of suffering beginning to engulf the world. This blindness is not only a moral failure, but a profound act of self-destruction. The crises we face are not just those of climate change, biodiversity, pollution, or inequality. They're merely symptoms. At the core, there is a crisis of values. They are crises of greed, of apathy, of selfishness. Our greatest danger is not somewhere out there. Our greatest danger is within us. It is our inertia, our hesitation to act boldly, our stubborn instinct to cling to outdated systems, even when we understand that they must be abandoned. Incremental change is simply no longer sufficient. In fact, it has become a form of complicity. Tinkering around the edges of systems that are fundamentally broken will neither avert catastrophe nor secure a just and sustainable future. But whilst this picture is bleak, we must not lose sight of the opportunities that crisis brings. History teaches us that the most profound transformations are born from moments of immense disruption. As the old systems begin to splinter, we certainly must not panic. We can still choose reinvention over ruin. We are being challenged to rewrite the rules, to force unprecedented coalitions, to design new positive economies and societies, and to construct a future that does not simply sustain life, but regenerates and restores it. This task is too fast for isolated actors to do alone. The age of solitary hero, if it ever existed in my opinion, is over. We are the few generations entrusted with an extraordinary and rare opportunity, one that few in history have faced. It is the chance to fundamentally redesign the system that underpins our societies, economies, and the way of life. It is an opportunity to create systems that regenerate ecosystems rather than deplete them, empower communities rather than marginalize them, and prioritize well-being over profit. This is more than an obligation. It is in fact a moment of profound responsibility. But it can only be realized if we confront complexity head-on, step beyond the comfort of well-trodden paths, and expand our imagination to envision and create bold solutions for the planet and humanity. The window to act is closing, and it's closing fast. If we squander this opportunity, history and future generations will simply not forgive us. So building bridges is now more important than ever. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nicholas, for the introduction. Thanks to Nature Finance for convening this and for the brilliant report. And thank you also to Paul Pullman for those wise words, which I think have set the scene brilliantly for this conversation. My name is Mille. I'm Nicholas's co-conspirator and co-facilitator for this session. I'm extremely passionate about this conversation, partly because I've spent most of the last couple of decades working with groups of stakeholders around the world to help them grapple with the future, both in the sense of imagining things that they may not have thought were possible, but also in the sense of coming to terms with some of the uncomfortable truths, realizing that some of the things we wish for are not possible or no longer possible. Some of the things we fear may be unavoidable, and that the future is unpredictable and uncontrollable, and nevertheless we have to find the courage and clarity to play our role in shaping that future, because in reality we are, with our actions and inactions, creating the future, and the question is whether we want to do so deliberately or not. And in the space of climate specifically, as someone who looks towards the future, I'm acutely aware of how not just the current reality is changing, but the space of future possibility is constantly changing in relation to climate. There are windows that are closing, as Paul said, and there are maybe other doors that are opening that we can choose to pay attention to. And that's very much what this session is about. Really looking forward to being in conversation with our three guests. I'm very sorry that Rupert couldn't be here. These three people are people who I've come to admire over the last couple of weeks, and really curious to hear their reflections today. So I want to start by diving right into the deep end, away from the shallow, and talking about mindset shift. And I want to start with Rupert. And Rupert, you're one of the people who has thought most deeply about this, from your role as a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, and now as founder of the Climate Majority Project. And I think when we talk about facing the reality beyond 1.5, a lot of people think of that as giving up, throwing in the towel, losing hope. But there are also more transformative ways of thinking about this. And so my question to you is, if we face the reality that we are beyond 1.5, what are our options in terms of how we can think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you. Perfect.
So look, the way I would start with your question, your vital question, is by saying that we only get somewhere if we admit where we're starting from. And when we're starting from is a place of massive failure. If you hear anyone saying, as people quite often do, I'm afraid, things like, oh, well, we seem to be passing 1.5, never mind, let's just turn straight to staying below 1.6 or staying below 2 or something. That is itself a failure, because what that person is failing to do is to harvest and harness the realizations that need to come from our failure to stay below 1.5 degrees. This failure, by the way, includes the massive failure of climate capitalism, the massive failure of carbon markets. The failure on nature, we should say, is, if anything, even worse. That's what the Stockholm resilience analysis tells us. We're bursting through the nature boundary even worse than the climate boundary. And there's no reason to believe that nature markets will be any better than carbon markets. They will probably actually work worse because of the greater complexity of nature. This is where I disagree with nature finance and with Nicholas. And the reason I'm laboring all of this is that the following point, I think, is crucially important. The failure on climate wasn't actually surprising. This is the mother of all collective action problems, the mother of all free rider problems. The word problem is completely inadequate to it. It isn't surprising that we're failing. It's disappointing, but not surprising. But I want to introduce a concept to you, the concept of the meta-failure. The failure wasn't surprising. The failure to learn from the failure is a little surprising. We are supposed to be Homo sapiens. We're supposed to be good at this sort of thing, at least. Understanding, knowing, learning. So what I want to say is we must stop, pause, and learn from the failure to stay below 1.5 degrees and the failure of virtually all existing climate policy. And what I would urge at this point is pivot to climate adaptation. If we pivot to adaptation, that is the best possible way of ending the meta-failure. Because when we turn from centrally focusing on decarbonization to also putting adaptation front and center, we are admitting failure, beginning to move to cope with that failure. So some of you will already be asking, what should I do? What should we do? And to start to answer that question, which I think we'll be getting into more in this session as we go on, I would say pivot to adaptation in your business. That means everything from thinking carefully about your supply lines to understanding whether your product or your business is even fit for purpose in the new world we're moving into. Pivot to adaptation in your business as well as in life and in politics. Do adaptation right. We'll come back, I'm sure, to what that point amounts to. And in terms specifically of what finance should do, you're maybe thinking, how do we get money properly into climate and nature? But as I've already implied, if you're thinking of that within a capitalist setting, I would say, actually, that's not really very important. It's not really going to help very much. Think of the Koch brothers. They made a huge difference over the last 20 years by putting vast amounts of money into climate denial, into building a movement that has been the basis, for example, for the rise to power of Trump. The Koch brothers did more with more of consequence, with a fraction of the money that's going into carbon and nature markets, by putting their money directly into movement building. We need much more and much bolder green philanthropy. Organizations like mine, Climate Majority Project, organizations like the Club of Rome, these could be rocket fueled levels of money. If you want to help save the world, which is now very hard to save, then do not bank on the financialization of climate and nature. Bank on organizations that are actually reality-based and actually have a plan for how to adapt to what is coming.
Okay, thank you, Rupert. I think that was a good lead-in for you, Carlos, when we talk about learning from failure, and you're at the helm of the Club of Rome, and it's exasperating to look at 50 years ago what you were already saying, right? You've been pointing to this for a very long time. So what is your understanding of why we haven't learned?
Yeah, and how do we learn what we already know?
Exactly.
Right. So thank you, Miller. Hello, everybody. I like that you put the emphasis on learning, because this is actually what didn't happen. As a collective, we didn't learn. Interestingly, 45 years ago, the Club of Rome published a report which, in my view, is as important as the Limits to Growth, titled No Limits to Learning. because we were already realizing, oh, something is not happening, and we were exploring, what would need to happen and what kind of learnings we could develop. But we didn't learn. I mean, the explanation is complex, and in particular, we should, but we don't have time now, to look into what happened in most of the world. And a lot of things happened in most of the world. I don't have time for that now. I will say what happened in the West. And in the West, what happened is a very strange thing that 40 years ago, politics in the West committed suicide. Very strange, because you wouldn't expect medical doctors saying that medicine is not important. You wouldn't expect engineers saying that engineering is not important, and whatever other professions. But we actually had politicians massively saying, oh, you know what? Politics and the state, as the expression in national states, in the system of national states that we have, politics and the state are not so important. We are not a society, we are a collection of selfish individuals, and the markets and technology will make it. And we are suffering now from the consequences of that suicide, creating, this meaning of a society which is not a society, of selfish individuals. So I'm surprised that we are surprised about the present crisis of democracy, because without society, you cannot have democracy. I'm surprised that we are surprised by the current pandemic of narcissism all over the world, including among leaders, because that started 40 years ago with this suicide of politics. But the point is not. That's my explanation about what happened in the Western world. Now, the point is, of course, not to come back to the 70s. We cannot do that. We are in a very different world. What do we do now? Because the consequence of that shift 40 years ago has been a fragmentation, a growing fragmentation of our societies into bubbles operating with different logics. And actually, the learning we need to have, learning in the sense of changing, has to happen at the societal level, and we have lost, by destroying the social fabric, we have lost a big part of our capacity for societal learning. So now, in each of the bubbles, if you look at business, at finance, at politics, at academia, each of the bubble has its own operating logic, which makes sense. If you are within one of those bubbles, you will do what the rules of that bubble, what the logics of that bubble tell you to say. But the point is that to address the challenges that we have, we need something at a higher level. And for all the efforts that are being done, for instance, by the finance community for sustainable finance, which I appreciate, and I think they are important, but it cannot be solved by finance, cannot be solved by business, cannot be solved by politics. How do we get back from this fragmentation? And that's the way forward, defragment. And many of the proposals that we're hearing are about that. And defragment means also starting to get engaged in processes of mutual learning across the chasms of the sectors, of the silos of the disciplines. We could talk about the academic world, terrible. Because the challenges we face are not disciplinary. They are across all disciplines. But also the chasms between worldviews, between countries, between cultures, and between generations. So defragmentation and mutual learning, for me, is the way forward.
Great, thank you. And Josie, over to you. So you work with a lot of conflict-affected contexts that may not be visible to, immediately visible to some of the people in this room. And I think you're someone whose, in Paul's words, eyes are not shielded by the barriers of comfort. So what do you think are our blind spots? What are we missing when we look to this world beyond 1.5?
It's a great question, and I think I'm actually going to build a lot on what Carlos just said. So if you were at the Building Bridges Summit on Monday, you would be forgiven for thinking that we live in a very peaceful, violence-free world. Because neither at the summit this year, nor the year before, nor the year before that, or the year before that, have we ever spoken about violence and conflict on the Building Bridges Summit. And I think it's really time for us to join the agenda on climate and nature finance and on peace and security, because these are intimately connected. And there was really one phrase on the Building Bridges Summit that really struck with me that was said by David Blood. Capital allocation without an understanding of impact is a mistake. Let me say that again. Capital allocation without an understanding of impact is a mistake. And yet we do not consistently understand or integrate our understanding of our impact on violence and conflict into our capital allocation. And therefore we are consistently making mistakes time and time again. So why is this? So conflict is on the rise. I think we all know this, and it's not just the conflicts that we see on our screens. According to the ICRC, there are 120 armed conflicts occurring across 40 countries in the world, and they have risen by 65% over the last 3 years. We know that businesses and investors, because of globalization and the dynamics of globalization, are increasingly exposed to these dynamics. They're either sourcing from these contexts, operating in them, supplying in them. And that we know that also business activities in conflict contexts are never neutral. Business actors like to think that they're neutral, but their impacts are never neutral. We can think of it as a continuum. We have violence and instability on one end of that continuum, and peace and stability on the other end. Businesses are contributing to one or the other. There's no neutrality here because business activities don't occur in a vacuum. So you might be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with me, and why is this woman on this panel? So the first question, therefore, that I have to you all, I suggest you raise one arm if one of these things is true, and 2 arms if both are true, and that you stand up if more than 2 are true. So first, do you drink coffee? Do you eat chocolate? So raise the second hand if more than 1 is true. Do you wear jewelry, a watch? So stand up if more than 3 are true. Do you have a mobile phone? Do you use transportation? Do you take medicines? Do you use herbal medicines? Do you drink herbal tea? Do you use paper? All of these things, and most of the room now is standing, all of these things are sourced, manufactured, or produced in countries affected by violence and conflict. So you should be asking yourself, first and foremost, as a consumer, am I causing or contributing or linked to conflict inadvertently by virtue of the things that I am consuming? And if you are an investor, you definitely need to be asking that question of yourself. And so then the second question, why am I on this panel? So the energy transition, climate transition, or adaptation is going to require massive injection of resources into conflict and violence, contexts affected by violence and conflict. We know that when resources are injected into these contexts, that they tend to create competition. Competition in contexts already affected by violence increases violence, it doesn't decrease it. Second, most of the metals and minerals required for the energy transition are found in countries affected by violence and conflict. So already, we have to join these 2 agendas. And thirdly, renewable energy, whether it's land, water, or other natural resources, there is an intimate connection. Renewable energy requires access to land, to water, and to other renewable resources. And most of these conflicts that we're seeing in the world have some connection with land, water, and other natural resources, as in these are the resources that people are already fighting over. So the future that we are currently planning is one in which we're going to see a huge increase in violence and conflict if we do not incorporate a conflict sensitivity lens into the climate, nature, and adaptation agenda.
Great, thank you, Josie. I want to do a second round, and I think there's a pattern in what all of you are saying, which is related to this notion that we're in the age of consequences. All 3 of you are talking about interconnectedness, consequences, and being aware of of those consequences and of these sort of chains of cause and effect. And I really love what you said about defragmenting, Carlos. And I want to reorder for the second round, which is going to be more around, we're not going to leave this session with any silver bullets or something you can do on Monday morning, right? But this is still not just about changing our minds, but also about finding some pathways to action. So that's where we're focusing this second round on. And building on what you've all said about this sort of systemic approach, essentially, Club of Rome has been working with a systemic approach for many decades. Sometimes you're criticized for your system's dynamic modeling and so on being too theoretical and abstract and difficult to put into practice. So what are your thoughts about how to really put that into action to deal with the challenges that we're talking about here?
Well, since the very beginning, the Club of Rome has a multi-sided soul, at least two-sided soul. There is, sometimes I say the Club of Rome is at the intersection of science and humanism, or to be more concrete, thermodynamics and humanism. And that means we have this analytical side of things, so the systems modeling that we continue to work on right now, basically to give a message. You know, the models depend on what you want to do with them. As modelers say all models are wrong, some are useful, you know, and what we are putting the emphasis on is to say a balance between equitable well-being for all humans and the planetary boundaries is possible. And this is the strong message of the Earth for All program, you know, very clear, very strong for the policymakers and whoever is interested. But there is the other face of the soul, you know, this humanistic part, which recognizes, you know, that we are very complex beings and we are part of life. We are in permanent interdependencies with all living beings and with the physical earth, which is part of life anyway. And there are many things that we cannot apprehend, in analytical frameworks. Mathematics, for all its power, is just one human language. And as Ilya Prigozhin said very long ago, reality is richer than we can express in any language. So it's about what is beyond our conscious understanding and what makes us mobilize all our capacities. Donella Meadows, the leading author of The Limits to Growth, wrote a very last paper more than 20 years ago titled Dancing with Systems. So we have to reconnect with our humanity and with all our capacities. We have to do something very strange as well to compensate the very strange thing that happened 40 years ago, which is betting on the humanity and the capacity of everybody. This is the foundation of another program in the Club of Rome that I created 2 years ago, the Fifth Element. And what is it about? It is about, so talking about what we can do, it is about flipping some concepts. For instance, the governance model, you know, we still speak of top-down and bottom-up. Sorry, people and the planet cannot be the bottom. You know, we have to flip this concept to say people and the planet are at the top. We have to trust them, because if we don't trust them, we know what happens. The loss of trust of people in the institutions comes from the fact that they know that the institutions don't trust them. And then the relationship is broken. And the institutions have to be put at the service of the people and the planet, and all of them, including, to follow up on one of the comments before, including, for instance, sciences and research and innovation and technology. Do you know how much we hear a lot about, oh, we need that amount of billion for this, that amount of billion for that. Do you know how much we invest globally in research and innovation every year? $2.5 trillion. 2.5 trillion. And are we sure that all of that go for sustainability, sustainable development, regeneration, whatever you call it? Of course not. Of course, the vast majority of that is not going for that. So this is just an example of a societal learning that needs, you know, this defragmentation that I was mentioning before, this trusting humanity, trusting the people. Without them, we will not make it. Forget about any kind of enlightened despotism, you know, to impose solutions to people. But start shifting the process that are already implemented in the society. For instance, the role of sciences, the evolution of education, of course, and all that, towards another direction. You know?
Thank you. Josie, dancing with the system, service of the planet, trusting the people. What does this look like in practice from your perspective, and what guidance do you have for the audience in terms of at least moving forward from a different awareness?
Yeah, I think the first is really a psychological barrier as well. I think it's really difficult for us to accept that we can have detrimental consequences when trying to do the right thing. That in trying to make sure that finance is going to climate, to nature, to adaptation, that we can actually have these unintended consequences that can be just so very devastating. But we need to accept that. We need to accept that by financing the climate agenda and nature finance and adaptation, etc., we will have these unintended consequences if we don't start incorporating a conflict lens. So in terms of practical steps, I think on the public kind of development financial institutions and impact finance lens, if you're doing climate-related work, you need to start incorporating a conflict lens into your work. And there are some really good champions in this space. Proparco AFD, I think, is doing an excellent job of making sure that this lens is incorporated into the work that they're doing in conflict-affected areas. And then same, if you're working on public and private equities side, and you need to make sure that you're managing your portfolio in such a way that conflict is very much on your agenda. So using active stewardship, and again, I think there are some very good examples. Depori Picti-Torretini here in Geneva has been using this approach for over 5 years now of making sure that in their investor engagement meetings with the portfolio companies on various issues, they always make sure that conflict is really integrated as a lens into the work that they're doing. So I think we need to just start making sure that these two agendas go very, very much hand in hand.
Can I ask you to just say a little bit more specifically around the Beyond 1.5 world and the climate reality and the relation to conflict? Yesterday you talked about conflict as an accelerator, and just making that link a little bit more around how do you see conflict evolving in a Beyond 1.5 world, and what does that mean for adaptation, some of the things that Rupert was recommending?
Well, conflict, of course, affects the most marginalized populations, and it also tends to impact, climate change also tends to impact and accelerate poverty and underdevelopment and inequalities. And so I think in a world post 1.5, because of the nature of drought and population movements in many of the contexts in which we're working, we're definitely going to see conflict increasing irrespective of climate finance. So I think we need to start preparing for a world in which there is more conflict and violence. I think the trend that we've been seeing over the last few years is only going to continue. There's definitely a huge upward trend in violence and conflict. So I think we need to prepare for that world and get better at understanding how to operate in these contexts in a way in which we're not only minimizing our negative impacts on conflict, but also trying our best with every intervention, with every engagement, to have positive impacts on peace and stability as well.
So actually conflict sensitivity is a climate adaptation strategy.
100%. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Carlos, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, if I may, I mean, first, this idea of beyond 1.5 degrees is, for me, part of a more general attitude, which is let's face reality. You know, as hard as it could be, as difficult as it could be. Because, you know, the other option is to keep being blind. And then immediately you say, oh, but then you depress people, then, no, because we have to elevate how we look at this, you know, at another level. Not to say, well, everything will be fine in the end. No. This requires a deep learning, a learning at a level which we are not able, or not very able to do right now because of the fragmentation of our societal systems, but that people on the ground are able to do. So the criticality of the situation is a precondition for the opening the space of possibilities. Until we really fail, we don't change. And a big part of the issue we have is that the people who are in the position to decide for others don't leave themselves in their lives, the challenges. But people who do are already moving. The seeds of the new, of what we think is actually new civilization, or civilizations in plural, are already there. So right. This moves the question from, you know, the typical linear and fragmented framework, the SDGs being the best example of that, with 240 indicators, and I work on indicator number 11.3, move from that linear and fragmented framework to the framework of there is a crisis, the space of possibility is open. Many of the branches coming out of this critical point lead to very terrible places in which we already are. Others are the occasion of the emergence of something new at a deep level, at a civilizational level, and that new is already happening. We just are not looking to that.
Exactly. In futures work, we say the future is already here, it's just not very well distributed. So how do we find where it is? Rupert, back to you, just for a couple final minutes. You distinguish between conventional adaptation and transformative adaptation or strategic adaptation, and you have this very interesting concept of the through-topia, that in a way there's no way of getting out of this or moving back, but we have to move through, and distinguishing the through-topia from the utopia and the dystopia. And I would love for you to share that with this audience, what that means.
Yeah, so let's start with that. It takes up right from what Carlos has just said. So we're heading straight for dystopia. Right? Now, traditionally when people are trying to come up with an alternative to a dystopian or catastrophic narrative or future, they cling to this idea of utopia. Oh, we can have a better world, everything can be fine. But tragically, everything is not going to be fine. To dream, for example, now of staying below 1.5 degrees in the safe zone is itself a key instance of dangerous, toxically positive, mere wish fulfillment fantasy utopian thinking. Through-topianism says, look, we can still have a good future, but the good future will come precisely from taking seriously the awful, horrendous challenges, disasters, etc., that we're going to go through. The disasters that we're going to go through can be the making of us. Look at history, look at the Blitz in the Second World War, for example, very close to the narrative of my country. What happened in the Blitz is that we were subject to massive bombing, but in response to that bombing, there was actually an increase rather than a decrease in morale. There was a reduction in suicide rates rather than an increase in suicide rates. We can actually rise to the challenge hugely. That's what we have to do. And that's the essence of my idea of through-topia. We need to create positive stories of the future, but they need to be reality-based, and they need to take the positive out of the negative. They need to find the upside of down. And then in terms of how this fits with adaptation being centered, so yes, I have a new book out, conveniently, called Transformative Adaptation. It's a little book where you can read the detail, but very briefly, the headline would be, most of the adaptation that is being done or talked about so far is not transformative, not strategic, not deep. It is only shallow, it is only defensive, it's only incremental, and that's not good enough. What do I mean? Let me give 2 quick examples. Firstly, if we're thinking about the crucial question which has been in our minds so much the past few awful months, the question of flooding, a shallow defensive mode of adaptation is to say, okay, we're flooding more, let's build higher hard flood defenses. If that's all that we do, then we're just making the problem worse. We're just fragilizing the system further. Eventually those flood defenses will be overtopped. They are in the meanwhile high carbon. We need a transformative response. We need to look upstream. We need to restructure networks of wetlands and peatlands. We need to change upland water management, etc. That would be transformative adaptation. And my second example, again, going straight to where the debate is. So in terms of the Nature Finance report on food, which I think is very interesting, regenerative agriculture, that is transformative and strategic adaptation. But I confess I'm very skeptical as to whether the new food technologies that were mentioned are. Is vertical farming going to be resilient to what is coming? A future where we're likely to have disruptions to electricity supply, a future where we will certainly have worse storms than ever before. I confess I'm very skeptical that it is. I'm not convinced that that actually is genuinely resilient or adaptive technology. So this is the debate that we need to be having. And we urge that the direction of travel is towards adaptation, which is genuinely strategic and transformative.
Great. So those are the conversations we need to be having in depth, and maybe spending a little bit less time on whether or not 1.5 is still alive, and more time on these questions of what is actually future-proof, what is actually resilient. Nicholas, I think you want to do a quick Q&A.
Yes. Is my mic working again?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. We do not have a ton of time, but we thought we would be able to take at least a few questions. Please, if you want to ask a question, be very, very brief. This is really an opportunity to get into this conversation. Thank you so much. So we have a lady here.
Thank you very much. Perhaps less a question than a comment. To Mila's remark, there are things we can do. There are magic bullets, and they all have to do with what was just mentioned by Rupert. We don't need a generation of new science. We need to do what we already know at scale for everybody, not just in the 25%. Next week we have a Futures Fair for Business and Finance, where we'll be showcasing examples of investor-ready propositions, but we don't get a chance to share those here.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for staying brief. Yes, 2 gentlemen here. Art, please.
Since 2015, we have spent $5 trillion to be going backwards. So my question is, there is $4 trillion that sits on the balance sheets of foundations that is unaligned. We allocate 5% of it every year. That's a tax issue. There is $4 trillion that sits in pension funds in the developing markets, unaligned in local government cash. This is not an issue of money. This is an issue actually of political will and change. And we are failing abysmally. Planning, give you another example. 50% of the SDGs, according to the World Bank, could be covered by planning. The UN response, the grand bargain, a commitment to 25%, we're now at 1.2%. It is a failure of our current institutions, of the institutions in this room. The fault, dear Brutus, lies not amongst the stars, it lies amongst ourselves.
Thank you for that comment. Thank you. I'm sure that's going to raise quite a few reactions here. Sir? Or here we go.
Great. Yes, I have a question as well, more for you, Carlos, because you mentioned that it's actually the politicians who failed us by committing suicide and assuming that we're all actually a bunch of selfish individuals. But actually, for audience like this, I think the true speech is it's the role of multinationals who are here to blame. They are the ones who put pressure on the politicians to shrink their power, to reduce always their power, except when it's to save them. You know, during the financial crisis, for example, then it's very convenient to have the state. But my question to you is, are we sure that we have the good diagnostic? Because we looked back at what happened. Are we sure that we really know and pinpoint on what was the problem? In my opinion, the problem is capitalism and the rules of capitalism that want only one thing, to grow, and to grow. And we cannot, build on the future if we don't look back and say, hey, that didn't work. And the role of multinational companies now is too big. It's almost merging with politicians. So we need to go back, reflect, and build new rules based on that. I would love to hear you on that.
Okay, thank you so much. This is great. Very, very quickly, one more, and then we have to stop. Please.
Thank you. My name is Johanna Zuleta, and I work championing the humanities, and I would like to know more from you, and very happy to hear your remarks on the First Lady's question as well regarding our ancient knowledge and reconvening with that, because mostly when we speak about innovation is directed to technology, but that's also consuming more resources. And I would like to know all of your opinions regarding how to bridge better ancient knowledge and the humanities, with human capital, with not only tech innovations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Who is willing to enter into these debates? Quickly, Carlos.
And ready.
Maybe Rupert.
And obviously, Rupert, obviously.
Maybe
Rupert as well.
you
Rupert, you
want
want
to start with
you want to
Rupert?
give
Yeah,
it a go?
I'll start. I absolutely love these questions and comments. They're all brilliant. On the last one, yeah, we need a Buddhist economics, and we need to learn crucially in the Western tradition from philosophical traditions such as Stoicism, which point an alternative to the growth mentality, which is indeed clearly at the fundamental root of our problems. In terms of the role of multinationals, I would say, think about what your USP is. What is the greatest power that you have? And I would say that it actually is your lobbying power. What multinationals ought to be doing is going to governments together and saying, regulate us better for the common good. We cannot do it all by ourselves. We can do it with you, and we're going to force you to do it to us. Regulate us better for the common good. And finally, coming back to the point about philanthropy, which is absolutely crucial. Yes. What foundations ought to be doing is being much bolder in their giving, and that means both in terms of the quantity, they ought to be spending down their endowments, because their endowments are going to be worthless in a world that collapses, and in terms of the quality of what they do. And that means, frankly, funding a lot more stuff which has real leverage and massive change potential, in which capacity I would humbly include the organizations of the Climate Majority Project and the Club of Rome. These are the kinds of organizations, as I said earlier, which could actually be game-changing. Far too much foundation money is spent on stuff which is doing very little to change the status quo.
Thank you, Rupert.
So, I think we have to be smarter than just using the blaming game. Thank you. Because, yeah, of course you are right, but, and it's a big but, could we stop using a concept like, as big as that, capitalism? I started not using it. Why? Because if we say capitalism, we are accepting that anything else can be labeled as communism, And we have to be smarter than that. Capitalism has many forms, many shapes, many different manners, and it's not obvious to me that we could build a consensus on getting rid of all its expressions. We have to deconstruct some of the concepts, because, for instance, capitalism, markets, and enterprises are not the same thing. Capitalism in its more rentier expression is against markets. So we have to deconstruct some of the concepts which are at the core of the issue, because, the blaming game is the easy way, in a manner, to address this. We blame somebody, and the scientists are blaming politicians for the lack of willingness. the people from finance business are also saying, oh, we cannot do anything if, unless politicians change the conditions. Politicians blame citizens very, very clearly today. Politicians blame citizens, and citizens are trapped in this process of fragmentation, and they blame each other. So we have to be smarter than that, and this is why we approach with the Fifth Element program, which, by the way, the name itself is a tribute to ancient knowledge and wisdom. Last year, we managed to get approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations a declaration of the decade of sciences for sustainable development, which was long due. It should have been done 10 or 20 years ago, but it was done last year, saying, among other things, that it's about to mobilize all sciences, natural one, but also social sciences, humanities, and traditional knowledge, for the sake of these challenges of humanity. So yes, we could get more and more about the diagnostic and blaming certain forms of organization of our society. We can have another session on discussing why the politicians committed suicide in the West. But overall, we have to be smarter. And this is why we propose to work on this process of mutual learning across the chasms in plural, the momentum which exists there, the tension between different poles, including the poles between generations, could lead to mutual learning, mutual transformation, mutual metamorphosis. So that thing that we call capitalism without looking into the details of what it is could morph into something else which would contribute to the balance of equitable well-being for all on a healthy planet.
Thank you. Josie, 30 seconds. Do you want to add anything?
I think they've said it all.
Great.
Better than I could.
Thank you so much. Mile, thank you so much for moderating. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. First of all, I have immense appetite to continue this work and this conversation in a strategic way. And secondly, to leave you with a quote from a legendary scenario planner called Pierre Wack, who said, even if something is not probable, if it's possible and high impact, we need to prepare. And we're doing the exact opposite right now. We're unprepared for the most probable future, and we're skirting around, holding on to an uncertainty at the edges of possibility. And so let's prepare and let's really expand the space of possibility.
Thank you, Mile. 30 seconds from my side. I know we are a bit over time. 30 seconds on my side just to thank you all for being here, both online and in the room. It matters a lot. As you said, Mile, we started this conversation. We will now have to expand it. I think this leaves me really with fundamentally Tolkien. All we have to decide is what we do with the time that is given to us. How do we choose to wield our power, invest our resources, and direct our attention? Who do we, in a sense, choose to be? How will we all play our roles? These are the very, very big questions. And it seems from the conversation we had here in this room, we really have an opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity to strive for greatness. And this is really, we hope this is an invitation for all of us to be extraordinary in a time that needs it a lot. Thank you so much to the speakers, Rupert, Josie, Carlos, and obviously Mile for facilitating this. Thank you to all of you once again for being here, and we wish you all an impactful, net positive day. Thank you so much.
Group photo.